the Army's most ambitious programs is the training of some 100,000 men in what has been called the Special Militia Training Program. Men are enrolled for a 6-week period, and during that time, they are taught all the skills that are required to save lives during a national disaster. Typical of the programs that are being held across Canada and the courses being run is this one here at Crumlin Army Survival Camp in London, Canada. With me I have Sergeant Paul Jelena, who was a member of the first course and has been retained and is now an instructor for the remaining courses. Exactly what is going on here, Sergeant Jelena?
Well, to begin with, sir, because of the importance of national survival training, we find it necessary to assume that none of the trainees know anything whatsoever about survival operation, rescue operation. And so we begin with, right from the start, a few simple knots that the Boy Scouts would use.
What knots are they tying here?
From the far end, we have a clove hitch. The next one is a timber hitch. Then a round turn with 2 half hitches, draw hitch, which is used in lowering a man from a second story and pulling his rope down with him.
And from this training, what do the men do then?
From here, we would go on to lashings, a method of constructing a lifting device.
When would you use this type of training, this lashing?
Well, often we're required to lift large, heavy weights, concrete slabs, that sort of thing. And in that case, we must often use materials that we have at hand, improvise. These forms of lashings are used to make things that we call A-frames, standing derricks, rigs with which we will lift these weights off the casualty.
And from here, what do we do next in your training?
Our next lesson is learning to lash a casualty in a stretcher properly, secure him so that he won't fall out if he's being lowered.
I imagine that this is a very important part of your training because further casualties could be caused if they weren't trained properly.
Yes, indeed, and we'll see in just a moment the reason for the great necessity of securely lashing a man into a stretcher. Now, on the first stretcher, as you will see, they have just begun to lash the casualty into the stretcher. They start with a clove hitch on the handle, lash the patient around the chest, over the hips and the knees. And now, as we go to the second stretcher, you will see that the casualty is almost completely lashed in. They've secured his feet, they've brought the lashing up the other side of the stretcher, secured it again with a clove hitch to the handle, and they are now lashing a triangular bandage across his head to make sure that his head doesn't fall forward. Now, the reason for the security of this lashing can be demonstrated here. On the third stretcher, you'll see a man completely lashed in. And if you'll watch, you will see them test the stretcher. Now, this testing is done in training to give the men confidence in their knots. You can see here the importance of a properly tied knot. By this means, a casualty can be lowered from a 5-story building, pulled up from a basement 2 or 3 stories. He can be lowered down a ladder, slid down a ladder, and at all times, we know that he is securely tied in there.
I imagine they take this part of their training very, very seriously, do they?
When they see this demonstration, they begin to realize then the importance of the knots. And finally, we have an emergency method of rescue or evacuation when we only have one rescuer available, or as from a confined space. Now, the first rescue operation we see is called the toe drag. The feet are placed under the armpits, and the tower gently moves himself backwards using his arms, drawing the casualty as gently as he can out of the confined space. Now, secondly, we have the fireman's crawl. The man's hands are tied using a reef knot and a round turn. The rescuer puts his neck under the man's hands, lifts the weight of the body, and crawls slowly forward on his hands and knees.
And now let's go to a briefing room where the men will have the opportunity of later putting all that they have learned into actual practice during an exercise.
Men, we've just finished the briefing for this exercise blowout. There are a few points I want you to remember before we get into it. First is safety. In this building, where the explosion occurred, you will find wires hanging down from the ceiling. Do not touch. Remember, electricity can kill. There are casualties in this house which we are going to get out. Be very careful how you handle the casualty. He is severely injured. We don't want to cause any more injuries. Do not move the casualty until you have determined what his injuries are. You are going to be judged on this exercise by me, and your final reports will show my judgment against you. Now, are there any questions? Okay, let's make this a good exercise. Let's go. Come on, boys, let's go.
Now, we've had our briefing and we're out in the field. We see the first rescue party approaching the devastated area, carrying their pack boards, 6-man team. The team stops, removes their pack boards. The leader will now designate several men to search the area for service casualties. The service casualties are always taken care of first. He will also designate a man to get a ladder. He will designate one man to open the pack boards. They are now going through the process of calling. And we see the man putting up the ladder to go up inside the building to search for casualties inside the building.
Troop leader, I have 2 casualties up here that require medical attention.
The searcher in the building has found a casualty or 2 casualties that require the attention of the crew. The section leader then orders what equipment he will need, and the crew begin to get ready to go inside the building to make the rescue. The rescue crew has entered the building. They're searching for the casualty, and now the rescuer sees the casualty. He approaches him, renders first aid, gives the casualty lots of reassurance, removes a field dressing or a shell dressing from his pocket, removes the debris, reassuring the casualty all the while. He begins to place the shell dressing in place to stop the bleeding. Now the patient has been lashed into the stretcher, first aid has been rendered, and 4 guide ropes or lifting ropes have been attached to the D's and handles of the stretcher. 2 men down below raise the stretcher as high as they can, and the 4 men up above lift them by means of the lifting ropes. The stretcher is brought through the hole, the handles of the stretcher are grasped, and the 2 guide ropes on the nearest side of the stretcher will be removed. The 2 remaining guide ropes will be left on to be used as guide ropes in lowering out of the window by ladder. The stretcher is placed on the ground. Ropes are removed, and then one of these lashings will be used as a bowline on a bight, placed over the handles of the stretcher, run through the pulley at the top of the ladder, and in this manner the stretcher will be lowered. The stretcher is now going to be raised to the edge of the window. The bowline on the bight is placed on the stretcher using 2 half hitches. The bowline is raised taut so as to ensure that it's in the center of the stretcher. And the stretcher is then raised and placed on the edge of the windowsill. Now the second casualty was in such a position that he could not be brought through and lowered by jib. So we're lowering him by using a leaning ladder. You'll notice the ladder is leant against the roof edge, lashed to stays inside the room. The stretcher is eased out. There's a pulley and block attached to the rung of the ladder, and the two guide men steadying the stretcher as he comes out of the window. Again, the rope is allowed to run up under the rung of the ladder. The stretcher is grasped by the guide rope men and lowered gently to the ground.
The film you have just seen, taken at the Crumlin Army Survival Training Center, is a graphic illustration of the serious business of the Army Special Militia Survival and Rescue Operations Training. And we hope that this presentation has given you an insight as to what the Special Militia Training Plan is doing as the Canadian Army's contribution in the event that Canada is a target in a nuclear war.